Okay, so hi everyone. Today is our final session of the Embodied AI lecture series for this season. We're going to start a new season soon, but nothing after CVPR. So we are very glad to host Sonia Chernova from Georgia Tech today. She directs the Robot Autonomy and Interactive Learning Lab, and her research focuses on development of intelligent and interactive autonomous systems. She's authored over 100 scientific papers and is the recipient of the NSF Career, ONR Young Investigator, NASA Early Career Faculty Awards, and many more. We are very happy to have you today, and yeah, take it away. Thank you for accepting our invite.
Perfect. Thanks, Kiana. And, thank you all for joining. This is so cool. I'm more than happy to make this interactive. I'm also more than happy to talk at you. I'd rather talk with you. So feel free to unmute and ask questions and chat. I don't know if I'll see the chat, so somebody yell at me. If there's an urgent question there, of course, there'll be time at the end. Awesome. So I'm gonna talk about going, so to speak, beyond the label, robots that reason about object semantics. So I'm talking about very embodied AI, as in physically embodied for the most part, not just virtually embodied. And the work that motivates, or the question that motivates a lot of my work, is how do we develop robust autonomous systems that operate in human environments? I think a lot of people on the call would share a passion for this question. It's mind-boggling. We have robots on Mars, and we don't have any robots like helping us out in our homes, right, or offices. It's we can that's a crazy difference. Of course, human environments, humans are the cause of a lot of those challenges, right? Each of our homes is different. Everywhere we go, we make it unique, we make it our own. We're always changing something that's very dynamic. And that makes it very hard to develop autonomous systems that truly generalize. So that's a huge problem, obviously, many fields and research problems relating to solving that. For today's purposes, let's see if I can advance the slide. The one I want to talk about is how do we leverage semantic reasoning in particular to achieve more robust autonomy. This has been a topic of interest for me for the last 5-6 years. I've been wanting to gain more abstraction in the way we model the world in order to achieve some of that generalization. So I'm going to talk about 3 different projects. Again, questions welcome. Before I jump in, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page for what I mean by semantic information, because it is somewhat of an overloaded term that I think the field is coming towards a commonality increasingly in the last few years. I'll use examples that are likely very familiar to the audience here, right? If I talk about computer vision and I talk about semantics in the context of computer vision, it's something like semantic scene graphs, right? How do we go beyond the labels of just saying horse, carriage, man, to understanding that the horse is pulling the wagon, carriage, whatever, the carriage is green, and the men aren't just, floating around, they're actually riding in that carriage. And that's what semantic reasoning means for image analysis. I can take that idea and expand it to other domains, right? XY locations on a map. We can say this region is someone's office, this region is a hallway. We can do that at pixel level, right? Surfaces or objects, or we can drill down into specific objects and say, objects have semantic parts that also have certain functions. So all these examples are really cool. They're from other people's work. And just to kind of give an idea of where I think semantic information, what it is, where it comes from, and so on. But to give a unified definition of what those examples actually capture, semantic information is a type of data abstraction, typically taking the form of word labels that represents concepts, facts, ideas, or beliefs about the world. And it's that abstraction that's key, right? We're taking low-level signal and abstracting it so that we can generalize over it. And we do that a lot in machine learning, but every time we talk about semantics, what it is, we're talking about some sort of abstraction that is now interpretable to humans because it comes in the form of a word label. And of course, when we talk about semantic reasoning, We now have that semantic information. The question is, how do we draw new insights based on that information we know? Inevitably, we only see part of the picture or know only some part of the world. Some part of it is unknown to us. How do we perform that inference? So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. One last slide of intro before I kind of jump into specific projects. A lot of the time in semantic reasoning, when we talk about data and we talk about representing information, we represent it in the form of triples, or known facts are represented in triples, like spoon is a utensil, pen is located in an office, stuff like that. And so maybe an agent or robot would collect a whole bunch of this data by exploring the environment. And then at some point would need to make a query or answer a query about an unknown in this triple. So example, where is the fork located? Fork located in blank, right? And you could say, is it in the office? Is it in the kitchen? Is it in the bathroom? This is a very high level example. You could, of course, make this much more low level about actual locations within a kitchen. This is just for the purposes of an example. And so that's a very common when I say performing semantic reasoning. This is one way the field has structured these kinds of problems. Many solutions to this from prior work involve drawing inference on large scale knowledge graphs, so large collections of this data. What we typically do there is build a latent model consisting of embeddings that map each of these symbols to a vector representing a fact or an object. We feed these into some sort of neural network, and the output is whether a particular relationship is likely to be true or not on a scale of 0 to 1. So in this example, we would say the fork is more likely to be located in the kitchen than the office. This is not something we, in this example, would have observed, but hopefully you'd use something like, hey, spoons are utensils, forks are utensils, therefore they're likely to be located in similar places. So this is kind of just the general formulation that the field has used. And I want to dive in. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that all fit this general mold, but try to push the sort of convex hull, so to speak, of problems that we're able to solve in this representation. Okay. So again, jump in if you have any questions. The first project I'm going to talk about is about semantic reasoning, about grasping specifically, given environmental context or richer environmental context. And so here we're talking about embodied agents, not embedded. Embodied agents that are very physical, talking about real robotic systems interacting very physically with their world. And the topic specifically we're going to look at is called semantic grasping. If you think about, the 30 years or 40 years of grasping literature that we have, a lot of it historically is focused on what's called power grasps, or just can we get this object off the table, right? Can we put a gripper on it and lift it up, and if it's off the table, yay, we succeeded. And thankfully, we've more or less solved that problem for many, many different, it's not entirely solved for some corner cases and hard domains, but for everyday objects, we're very successful at doing that now. And so the next challenge, though, is can we adapt the way we grasp to the type of task we actually have to perform, right? Because the humans, depending on what we're going to do with the object, grasp very differently. If I'm writing with a pen, I hold it one way. If I'm giving it to you, I hold it a very different way. So this is the problem of semantic grasping. And in order to perform semantic grasping, unsurprisingly, it requires a lot of context. You need to know, A, what the object is, B, what are you going to do with it? But maybe some other factors are also relevant, and that's where I want to talk about. All right, very briefly, prior work, we're not the first ones to talk about semantic grasping. It's been work on it from the very low level, kind of visual 3D modeling almost perspectives, where you look locally at the shape and color and visual properties of the region you might be grasping, and you analyze it and you try to decide whether it's a suitable place to grasp something from a semantic standpoint. This type of work has been successful, but the problem is getting it to generalize to unseen objects, right? So if I show you this picture, let's take the bottom row, the 3 different bottles. visually and shape-wise, they're so different that you end up needing a lot of data to actually train something very generalizable, right? It's very hard to generalize to an unseen object. Others in the field, as recently as 2019, have said, okay, we don't actually need it to train everything bottom up. There's just general rules that would, we teach this kids in kindergarten. When you hand someone scissors, hand it to someone with the handle first, right? Instead of the blade first. When you are going to use the spatula, if you're going to use it to flip something, use the handle, otherwise don't use the handle. This is easy. Why don't we just write rules? And well, the problem with rules is that they work up until you have a lot of different objects and a lot of different tasks and a lot of different object states. What if the object's dirty? What if it's hot? And so writing rules kind of gets out of hand. So we don't really want to do rules either, but we do want to generalize. And so our work contributes something we call context-aware grasping engine, or CAGE for short. It's a semantic representation that incorporates much more diverse contextual information than in previous methods to try to not over-rely on vision only. It's trying to use lots of different types of information. And instead of rules, we're using a neural network, particularly the wide and deep model, in order to learn the semantic generalization, the semantic rules inherently from data. So we don't have to hand code them. Another thing we add through this work is, at the time, this was the largest semantic grasping data set to date. It's 14,000 grasps. We have since released an even larger one, actually, but it's still a very large one that tells you, for different contexts, what the right grasp is. All right, so let me talk a little bit about how this works and what I mean by context. I keep saying context, let me now define it. We're going to argue several things. I'm going to get your hand as soon as I just going to finish my sentence, which is we're going to say we have an object, in this case, a ladle. We know what the task is, which is to scoop. We know this ladle is currently empty. And we have information that we're going to be getting from our visual sensors, as well as a really cool sensor called a spectrometer that helps to identify the material properties. Okay, question.
So maybe you'll get to this later, but how do you represent the grasping? How many point of contact can it have, or how do you?
That's a great question. So we're going to take a snapshot with the RGBD sensor for the object, and we're going to use an more or less off-the-shelf untipoidal grasp sampler to figure out where the gripper could be placed, such that you would get a power grasp that is stable for lifting the object, right? And so we're sampling all the possible places you could place the gripper such that when it closes and lifts, the object won't fall out. And this is really nice work out of Rob Platt's work at Northeastern. I'll show a picture of what it looks like in a second. And so what we're doing is sampling lots of grasps and then ranking them to see which one semantically makes the most sense. Great. Any other questions? Okay. So the question is, for me then, is how do we take lots of data and use it to inform our grasping in this work? I'm going to use this running example with this ladle. I want to scoop with this ladle, and I know that this ladle is currently empty. This is one of the only ways that we're cheating in this work. I'll relax that assumption in the next project, but right now we're assuming we know that the state is empty. You could get that from vision. It's just a little bit harder and less reliable. So here we're giving that information to the robot. All right. So what can we do with this? We can use the robot's onboard sensors to extract both a 3D model of the object as well as the semantic segmentation of the object parts. This is another off-the-shelf work that we're building upon called affordance net. And it allows us to identify both the handle, which is graspable, and the support part, which is the functional part of this ladle or spatula, whatever it is. I guess it's called spatula in the slide. And so we can identify this as spatula. We now know the object label, and we know it has different affordance parts. Now, this particular affordance method we're using what's shown on the top. There's other ways to segment objects based on shape, based on heuristics, and so on. We find that affordance-based segmentation generalizes better than other types. I'll show a slide for that in a second. But it's also just not enough. I could stop here and say, hey, let's just learn some rules about how I should pick up cups, based on where the contained part is and where the grasping. Why can't we just always grasp the grasping part? And as I'll show, it really depends on context. And we tried to crowdsource a lot of context. We said, how would you pick up a cup if it's hot? What about if it's hot and full of something, right? What if it's dirty? How would you pick up a cup? And so it's not just about knowing which part is normally graspable, but the state of the object, if you care about it and can detect it, helps to inform the manipulation preferences for how to grasp it. But this segmentation, again, AffordanceNet is very cool. We've had a lot of success using it because if you look at it, you can not only generalize within an object class, but also across. And so here we have a bowl has a contained property, but so does the pot. And that helps us generalize to objects the robot's never seen before and to know how to grasp it, which is pretty cool. All right, the other thing we're doing here sensing-wise is also very cool. We're using a spectrometer to detect the material, to know that this thing is plastic. Zachary Erickson, who's now at CMU as an assistant professor, was the one who came up with the idea of robots using spectrometers. It's a $300 sensor that the robot holds. It works about as fast as I just showed you. You run an LSTM to classify what material you're looking at. And it's so cool because it opens up the world of materials to robot systems. And so we care about this because the way you interact with maybe a plastic knife is different from a metal knife. Maybe you know that you shouldn't grab the metal blade of a knife. It's dangerous, could maybe damage the sensors of the robot or a person's hand. You don't have to be nearly as careful with a plastic knife. They're much more safe. All right, what else do we do? And finally, here's the grasp. And Kiana, this is kind of an example of what you were asking about. It's a little hard to see maybe in the video, but these little arrows show the approach angle of the gripper for different grasps. And you can see it's sampled a whole bunch of grasps along the length of the object. And it says, yeah, you could use any of these. And the question now is, how do we rank them to get the best one? And so here, all this information we've now gathered in these colored boxes at the top that I've labeled X, that's our input into our model. This is what I call context for the grasp. It tells us, I have this thing, I want to use it. This is what it's like. How do I pick it up, right? And what we want to do is predict Y, which is the particular, the suitability of a given grasp. We're going to use this wide and deep neural network, which came out of Google in 2016, I believe, for recommender systems. It works super well for our application. It has these two parts, right? The wide component captures kind of complex reasoning patterns based on combinations of semantic features. So for example, if you want the model to learn that grasping, if you want to avoid grasping the part that is the contained part when you're pouring something, right? This is the part of the network that's going to learn that and to learn to generalize that. It's going to pay attention to contain and cup and pouring. It's a very simple model. It incorporates those encodings and then applies a linear model to learn very simple rules about how to pair these different features together. The deep model uses multi-relational embeddings. And then this one is the part that's going to generalize a little bit better to unseen contexts. For example, applying rules that are learned for pouring to also scooping. Let's not cover the opening when we're trying to pour. Let's do the same when we're scooping. This is where we see a lot of this type of generalization happening. And this is using these embeddings passed into multiple hidden layers of the model. And then, of course, you just combine all this in order to get the combined network architecture to kind of get the best of both worlds. And we'll show in an ablation study that actually both sides of this network contribute to the overall performance of the model, which is nice. And ultimately, like I said, the result is that we end up with a ranking of grasps. And here the robots determines that in order to scoop with this spatula, it should grasp the object by this particular point, which is reasonable. Now, again, we apply this to our huge data set. We train on a lot of it and then withhold a decent chunk of it, both multiple ways, withholding context, withholding entire objects, and so on and so forth. And we benchmark this against context agnostic, which ignores any contextual information, just tries to grasp the best, most stable grasp. VF, the visual features, is the one that's based on just low-level visual info. The frequency table FT is one based on, it's kind of like a co-occurrence frequency, right? It looks statistically at which patterns emerge statistically most frequently and bases on that. We're not benchmark against rule-based because that would require us to write over 700 rules, and we weren't going to do that. We train on a bunch of it and test on 30% of the data. And you could see that our work statistically significantly outperforms the baseline. And within the ablation study shows that, you know, if we cut out deep or wide or state information or task information, the performance always drops. And the big takeaway here is, you know, the more data you have, unsurprisingly, the better. If your grasping actually depends on all of these factors. But more simple techniques like visual techniques just struggle to get the amount of meaningful context out of their input that you need. So kind of going from multiple modalities is very helpful. Of course, nothing's fun without some videos. So here's a video. I'm going to pause it for a second. In this video, it's side by side, showing two scenarios. So on the left, so in both cases, we have this pot, it's empty. On the left, we're going to be scooping with it. On the right, we're going to hand it to somebody. And you can already see that the robot's approaching very different grasps in order to pick up the object. This is hot versus empty to hand it to somebody. And the suitability of these grasps was trained by Turkers. They kind of favor the way humans would do it. This is one of my strangely favorites, but here it's going to be poking or stabbing somebody. It's never seen how to poke anyone with a pot, but it generalizes from other objects and learns to do that with the handle. All right, I'm going to play it again while I answer some questions. I think there's a couple, right?
Yes, I think Karthik was first.
Hi, Sonia. Nice to see you. I had a question. It's very interesting that you're using the geometrically driven grasps here. I wonder if you have multiple solutions for a particular scenario. And if so, how does that impact the performance? At the same time, the learning of like this semantic reasoning. And an additional question in the same direction would be, did you see something like something that probably not human, like humans would not do that, but then the robot figured out that that's probably a good grasp because, you know, it's stable and it probably made sense for the robot's gripper, not necessarily for us straight away. So yeah.
That's a great question. So for the first one, you will, because of the way we're sampling, you could get multiple really good sampled grasp along the handle, for example, right? So let's say the handle is the right place. It could have multiple, and they'll just be ranked, and usually there'll be a very small difference between them, and the max will just arbitrarily be one of them, but there could be multiple ties. And if you miss one of them, you know, sometimes grasping is not, you know, not going to work. You could also go for the second best, right? You can try several of them if several of them are good, but it's not usually a problem, right? It actually adds robustness to the model, the fact that we're using sampling in this way, because we have multiple ways to grasp in a semantically meaningful way. As far as your question about did it figure out something that surprised us, that's a really good question. We trained it because of the way it's trained to know it's a supervised learning problem, right? We show it contexts and we say this is the right type of grasp to perform for this particular problem. We didn't make up those grasps. We asked Turkers, we gave them scenarios. We said, here's your cup. It looks like this, and it's hot, and you're going to give it to a friend. Where would you touch it? And because we collected the data from humans, the model is biased entirely towards human-like behavior, so we didn't really see. It's not emergent in any way.
Thanks.
Yeah.
My question is about the rule-based methods. Usually we don't like the rule-based methods because it's hard to write rules, and usually they don't generalize and so on. But on the other hand, we have this learning-based method that, and my understanding is that we need a lot of supervision to train that model. We need a lot of annotation. So what is basically, it's as tedious as the rule-based method. So what is the advantage of learning-based method? Can't we just write a set of rules and maybe with some with few interactions we can learn the concept, and we might not need a lot of data to learn that?
That's a great question. I think if you could bias the learning with some amount of rules or scaffold it in that way, that would be super cool. I haven't seen anyone do that yet. The general benefit that we find from learning is that it generalizes to objects it's never seen, right? Because of that semantic object segment, the segmentation I showed, right? That says this is handle and this is the contained part of an object. What we find, as long as that segmentation functionally works, we're able to generalize really, really well to classes of objects the robot's never seen, which is a little hard to do with rules, or no one has managed to do it with rules yet, or no one's figured out how to structure rules in a way that to leverage that same level of abstraction.
Thanks.
So I think it's really cool that you generalize to a novel unseen context, if I'm not wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
You so how do you give the new context to the model? Is it just a word embedding? Is it how do you specify this new context, like scooping?
So that's a great question. The only thing we can generalize over new objects, we can generalize over new combinations of context, but if you've never seen the action scoop before, that one is like absolutely never, right? You never heard of the word, never have no idea how to do it. That one, I haven't seen any of the works be able to do that, right? That's generalization to a new task. So there's kind of a hierarchy of generalizations which we can do. Withholding an object is about as far as the field has come, right? Withholding an entire action and just saying, I want you to do foo. Could you please do foo? And even to a human, that doesn't really make any sense because we don't know what that means. So it has to have at least a little bit of an example of that action to generalize. But where we can generalize is if we say, I've shown you a couple of examples of scooping with a ladle. Now I'm going to give you a cooking pot. Can you scoop with that, right? Or how would you scoop with that? And so that's where the generalization comes in.
Got it. That was exactly why I was confused. Yeah, that explains it. Thank you.
Yeah. Do we have another question?
Yeah, I think just related to what Kiana was asking.
Yeah.
So does your current network or the learning pipeline allow you to do this fine-tuning quickly? Any comments on that? Like, let's say I had a new subset of objects. Of course, can I use like the pre-trained model that you have and maybe fine-tune it for new contexts?
Sure.
And
yeah, you can.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we already generalized to unseen objects fairly well without having to tune anything, but the performance would obviously go up if you tuned it further. Sure. These are all great questions. Anything else before I keep going? Okay. All right. Cool. So I think we've discussed this. I'm gonna, let's see if I can get back on focus. Here we go. I'm gonna skip the summary slide other than to say, you know, the overall goal here is that more context, the better. You can really expand what the robot is able to reason about and do with this much richer representation than that's been tried before. I think that's one of the core contributions of this work. Let me jump into our second project, which pushes that idea further. Still talking about objects, not so much grasping anymore, we're just talking about objects more generally, and even more multimodal data. Semantic modeling of those objects from many different modalities. And of course, there's a whole field of work on this, lots of really cool work in the last few years, from visual modeling, haptic, auditory, active perception. And you can load your robot with sensors, and no matter what, how many things you load onto it, still some information is going to be unknown. Now, you're always in this situation where you still have to answer a query like, where's the fork? Or where are my keys? We do that all the time as humans. That the robot needs to do that as well. But we don't, you know, the goal is, if we have all these modalities, this is great. How do we take advantage of a lot of this information at the same time? Now, one way to frame the work that we're going to be talking about is in the past project that I just talked about, we inferred the state of the object was always given, right? I said the ladle, or the spatula, is empty. In this one, I want the robot to be able to sense the environment and infer the state of the object by itself. So for example, here we have an object in the refrigerator. The robot can, a temperature sensor, use the spectrometer to detect material, know its location from the map and from its own sensors. And it's going to say, in this case, based on all of its observations, that this object is full. Now you can see this cup is opaque. The robot visually can't confirm that, but this is its best guess. And so the example here, it's not so much about state, but it's the fact that it's taken lots of different modalities, put them together to make perform this inference. Now, again, prior work where I want to take you is a kind of a semantic representation path here. All prior work in this area has looked at pairwise relationships between concepts. Like, cup is made of glass. Cup has property fragile, right? So these are pairwise relationships between two facts. In other fields, people have moved beyond just pairwise relationships. And one of the reasons is that sometimes these relationships are not so separate, right? They're actually correlated. But if we think about them only in pairs, we lose that correlation. For example, if I say, hey, can you get me that cup in the cabinet? In your mind as a human, when you think about a cup in the cabinet, you're going to make some assumptions because you observed a lot of cups and cabinets, and most of the time they're clean and most of the time they're dry, right? If there was anything else, you'd be a little bit surprised, especially if it was dirty. That'd be pretty strange. And so that means that knowing that the cup is in the cabinet should help us predict the state of that cup, that these facts are not independent, right? And so our goal is to enable robots to think about these collections of multimodal properties, as many facts as we know about in the object, in order to predict things that we don't know. And in particular, we're going to use something called an n-ary relation, n-ary representation. Here's an example of n equals 4. In a couple of slides, I'll show you other n's in order to model the relationship between many different factors. And so going back to this example with the cup, if all I know is I have a cup and I say, hey, where is the cup? All I know is cup, the label. Well, maybe it's in the sink, maybe it's in the cabinet, maybe it's somewhere else. In this slide, it just gives you those two options, right? But if I know a second fact about the cup, if I can also know, get me a clean cup. Someone says, get me a clean cup. You're not going to look in the sink anymore. You know, the cabinet is the right place to go for a clean cup because you need both of those factors to be true. And in fact, so this entity relations, entity representations, it's been in development in many years, for many years in the knowledge graph community. But as far as I know, it hasn't really made its way into kind of embodied agents and semantic representations for embodied agents until very recently. And it's so flexible, right? And you can have a still binary pairwise representation with n equals 2, or you can go n equals 5, or you can go up in order to understand how, in order to model kind of the correlation between multiple different factors. Now, one of the challenges why this hasn't been embraced by the community is collecting data to train these models is really hard. It's very easy to say, to ask people, what are cups usually made of? Where do you normally find them? It's a very easy question to answer. It turns out it's much harder to ask people kind of exhaustively, combinatorially, where would you find a light paper cup that is dirty, right? And you have to start giving them like incredibly detailed, combinatorially complex questions about objects. And so the first thing we did was crowdsource lots of this information, all kinds of objects. It was a multi-stage crowdsourcing process. It's described in our paper. I'm not going to get into it, but it had things like, here's a cup that's red, it's thin, short, it's for pouring, it's plastic, it's full, it's compressible, it's hot, and it's on the table in the kitchen, right? All of these things are true about the cup. Or there's these other objects as well. And so we presented people with hundreds of these objects, 1,400 objects, in lots of different scenarios. Actually, it's fewer objects, 1,400 scenarios. I'll have that on another slide. And we wanted to learn, how do we predict unknown facts about these objects? And so we introduced this transformer-based neural network that enables us to model generalizable patterns from all these observations that we collect. So imagine a robot drives around the environment, observes objects in the scene, such as this red cup that was on the kitchen table. Robot looks at it, it's like, hey, it's hot, okay, cool, now I know that. And it's observed all this stuff, and now it's learning this generalizable model. So the transformer takes as input all of these embeddings of properties that were observed, and builds a contextualized embedding of these properties. And then it predicts, using that embedding, things that might not be known. And to train this transformer, what we've done is we've taken these scenarios, so to speak, right? For example, here's a blue cup that's thick ceramic, full, it's hard, it's room temperature, it's dirty, it's in the sink in the kitchen. And we hide one of the known facts about it. Right, so in this case, we mask the fact that it's in the kitchen. Sorry, we mask the fact that it's in a sink. We ask the model to try to predict the location, and so this is a self-supervised process where it learns to model each of these properties given the other types of information. All right, and you can do this for sink, you can do this for ceramic, you can do it for blue, et cetera, lots of different factors. And then, of course, you can do it for other scenarios. There was the blue cup. Now we have red cups in the bathroom by the sink. By the way, bathroom cups are fundamentally very different than kitchen cups, which is a cool thing to learn, right? This is really cool. The model will use this entity knowledge as much as you give it. If all you say is, give me a cup, it'll do one thing. If you say, give me a clean cup, it'll do it another way. If I say, what about a cup that's white, ceramic, room temperature on the rack in the kitchen, it'll give you a very detailed answer. It can fill in a lot of this information at different levels of abstraction. At the heart of this is this attention mechanism, which was also really cool. If we visualize the attention weights, you can see it's modeling meaningful data. So for example, on the bottom right is cleanliness. And you can see that cleanliness of an object is very dependent on its dampness, the location of the object, and whether it's full, which makes sense. And then temperature to a little bit of a degree, which room it's in to a lesser degree, and so on. So that was fun to look at. And overall, so we collected the most diverse data set we know of for semantic kind of multimodal data. So again, 1,457 different instances of objects, 200 properties, 11 object classes, so lots and lots of different information. And we trained this model, and we wanted to test how it's working. We benchmarked it against other methods. The one highlighted is, the bottom is ours. The MLN, the Markov Logic Network, actually had the second best performance. The MLN is crazy computationally expensive to run, right? It's over 150 times more expensive than our method, and we still outperform it in terms of all the metrics. MRR hits at 1, 2, and 3, and so on. And so we also took this. Oh, so here's another cool comparison we did. One thing we want to know is how good are people? Yeah. Okay, compared to MLN is one thing. We wanted to know how good people are at this task. So we took this apartment in our lab and did a mock-up of it that's shown on the right. And we asked 50 people, 5 people to predict locations of 50 different objects, kind of semantically grouped objects. And then we compared how well they perform compared to our algorithm. And ultimately, just to show how hard this task is. So here's the result. The humans are in this dark blue, and they're not at 100%, which is not surprising. If I tell you, where's the wet sponge, you know, you're going to have a good guess, but it's not going to be perfect. And our performance is pretty close to them, but not quite human performance. Yeah, Kiana.
Quick question. So this problem can become ill-defined if there are multiple answers, or do you take care of that, or how do you evaluate that?
Here, it's not exactly ill-defined. It's just that you have a ranked solution, and you go through the list. So here's the robot performing the task, and it's looking for a dry sponge, and it says, well, maybe one place is on the counter, and then I'm going to look inside this drawer, and on the left you can see it found it at its second location. And that's why we report hits at 1, hits at 2, hits at 3. After 3 we kind of stop, but you could keep going. It's a ranked response, and that's what humans do too, right? They're like, well, where did I put my keys today? You look in one location, second, and hopefully you find it by the third. So totally, absolutely a fact of this, and we 100% account for that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for leading me into the next slide. Any other questions? This is a good time to pause. Okay. So that video, so this also works on the robot, and you know, and what we're basically showing here is that semantic reasoning of this type, kind of multimodal n-ary, really enables the robot to predict much more multimodal, much more complex facts about objects in a much more rich way than anything we've done in the past, which is really cool. And this transformer-based neural network's doing a nice job with that. All right. I'm going to briefly just go over a third project. I'm not going to spend as much time on it, just to leave time for questions at the end. But the last one I want to touch on, it's an important one to me, is semantic reasoning for user interaction. When I defined semantics at the beginning, I mentioned that it's an abstraction of raw data into something that's a word label. And word labels are inherently human readable. And I think there's not enough work being done in leveraging semantics to make black box systems more explainable to their users. This is like a low-hanging fruit for our field. So, you know, the scenario we're looking at here is we have a robot, it's doing some stuff, and then eventually something goes wrong and it stops. You know, and robots these days, mostly just that's what they do. They stop and they stare at the same spot, and you walk in and you're like, well, what are you doing? What happened, right? And you typically don't get an answer. And of course, if you're the user, that's very confusing. And so the question for this research project was, how does the robot generate explanations that can help non-experts, non-roboticists, not any of the people in this audience, assist figure out what happened, what's the cause of the failure, and how to fix it. You know, do you reboot the robot? Hopefully not. You know, there's probably some other solution. And so this gets us into the area of XAI, right? Explainable AI, basically. How do you make robots less of a black box? And this is a kind of a two-part work. I'm not going to talk about part one. It's an HRI paper, which was our first in this area to show just the importance of explanations, to show that users really don't have a clue about these errors unless you provide explanations, and that both kind of the context about what the robot can perceive in its state and its history of past actions are very useful for people when they're trying to interpret these explanations. So building on that work, which had kind of a limited scope of what it could explain, what I want to talk about now is how do you, in a generalizable, scalable way, extract information from the scene in order to provide this explanation. In other words, how do you have like an end-to-end system that takes some scene and produces explanations, regardless of what objects are there. And we're going to just look at it in the context of manipulation here. And it's not all possible. Like, it's just scratching the surface, to be honest, right? But I'm really excited about the promise of this. What we do, semantic scene graphs, in particular, you know, we take the robot's manipulation action has failed. Maybe the object was too far away. Maybe it's too cluttered by other objects. Maybe it's occluded. It can't get a good grasp. All of these, by the way, look exactly the same to the user. The robot just stops with its arm there and doesn't move. There's a number of these manipulation problems that visually look the same. So we use MotifNet to generate a semantic scene graph of the objects in front of the robot. We customize this a little bit because we change the relationships that are in the semantic scene graph. For example, we do occluded, which is not traditionally done in semantic scene graphs, but for us, it helps to capture that relationship for when an object is blocked by another one. Partially blocked. If it's entirely blocked, then it's not visible, right? So that then you're done. So this is the SSG, right? Semantic scene graph explanations. Now, one thing I could do is take this entire SSG and say, okay, the robot's going to pick up this can in somewhere in the figure, and let's explain what happened. Now, this type of explanation is awful. The robot couldn't pick up the can because it's on the table, occluded by the pitcher, blah, 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 blah. It lists all the possible things. Nobody wants to listen to that. So, of course, we want to filter this so that we can get a much more detailed explanation, kind of filtered. We call this SSGR for ranked. And what we're doing is using a trained pairwise ranking algorithm that learns the preference of which edges or relations are more relevant to errors, manipulation errors. So this is very easy to train, actually, and works remarkably well, very simple, that enables us to produce a very targeted explanation. Like, the robot couldn't pick up the can because it's occluded by the pitcher and too close to the cups. By the way, that captures 2 potential errors, which is also cool. You're not limited to just one. And so we were doing this project right in the middle of the pandemic. We ended up using AI2 Thor to generate more examples, dozens of different scenes, examples, objects, and so on for different errors, like, hey, the cell phone's under this heavy book, or the pillow is too large to pick up. So we had lots of different examples with different characteristics that I'm going to skip describing. And then we conducted a user study. What is my laptop doing? There we go. We conducted a user study where we asked 93 people to help us identify the cause of the failure and how they would fix it. And the way we ran the study is we showed them 16 scenarios, different ones with no explanations, just to see how good they could guess before. And then 16 more with explanations, 16 new ones to see how they would do with those explanations. And we did 6 different study conditions, one with no explanations at all before or after, just to see random guessing performance. One is a baseline from prior work, which is called CB. It doesn't work for this manipulation project particularly well, but we did benchmark against it. And then we did 2 variants of the semantic scene ones, both ranked and unranked. So SSG and SSG-R. And then we did them with an automatically generated scene graph using MotifNet, and then kind of a hand-scripted, completely perfect, just to remove the errors there as well. So those have stars. And I'll show you the results really quickly. If you don't explain anything, people get marginally better just because they're learning machines, and you would expect humans to have learned something through trial and error. But they don't get very far. Our baseline doesn't help because, like I said, it's actually not structured for this problem. If you give them the overwhelming, you do the brain dump of the entire graph, yeah, it helps, but not as very much. And finally, if you do the targeted, the ranked ones, it helps a lot. And you get very, very good performance. These are, what I gotta say is, what to me excites me about this work is just the potential that semantics have for making our systems much more interpretable to people. If we can harness that and we can talk about what the robot perceives and what it's reasoning about and so on, there's a lot we can do there as far as making our systems much less black box than they are now. And to close it off, okay, I'm just gonna wrap up and open it up for more questions. To me, the big deal here, I've talked about 3 different projects. All of them have a theme. The more data you're able to think about, the more you're able to reason about abstractions, the more we can expand robot capabilities. I will point out that capturing the right level of abstraction is really important. There's another work we have from AAAI a couple of years ago that shows that you can do this autonomously. Like, you can adapt which level of abstraction we use. And machine learning can do that to some degree, but overgeneralization is a problem, undergeneralization is a problem as well. So that's kind of a challenge for the field. And last but not least, of course, is we should be leveraging semantics to make our systems much more interpretable to users. All these are published in ICRA, RSS, and IROS in the last year or so. So if you want to know more details or I skipped something, feel free to take a look. And if this is largely the work of my amazing students, and the 2 that led the work I'm talking about are Wei-Yu Liu and Devlina Das. So lots of thanks to them and the rest of our team. And with that, I'm going to stop and ask for if you have any more questions.
Thank you so much for the great talk, and it's really interesting. A lot of very cool projects. Let's see. Okay, Rusbe.
Thanks, Sonia, for the talk. I just have a quick question about the last work that you presented.
Yeah.
So the scene, did you update the scene graph on the fly? I mean, some of the relationships might depend on the agent location. For example, occlusion relationship, depending on the location of the agent, the occlusion relationship might change. Do you update the scene graph, or do you use a fixed?
Yeah. No, it's generated in the robot drives up, it tries to reach, and then it generates the scene graph once the error occurs. So it is definitely, that's not hard. What we aren't doing, what we're not pairing it with is active perception, which would be super cool. Like, what if you drove around and looked at the table from multiple angles? We're not doing that. But we're just doing it from that static scene that represents the robot's current view.
I see, thanks.
Hi, Sonia. Thanks for the great talk. I have a question on the second part of the talk. I was wondering if there is a temporal component that is being used. For example, let's say the retrieval task. Let's say the robot is actively working on certain objects, and then probably did like pick and place and moved it to a different location. Is that easy to be considered in this framework? And like, how do you think that will impact the general the common sense context that you're trying to learn? Thanks.
So if I were to rephrase the question is, how do we combine the common sense context with like real-time observations?
Yeah.
Or history of past actions as well, right?
History of past actions, yes.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We didn't do it in this particular work, but we've done it in other projects in the past where you're more or less maintaining a semantic map, right? That's influencing the weighting. This work, we didn't, it's purely kind of a theoretical, we're trying to show theoretical results based on this very large data set. And then the robot experiments are kind of backing that up. So we didn't pair it here. If I was to do it, there's some question of how do you weigh? At what point do you trust your memory? And at what point do you start to trust semantics, and how do you combine the two? I don't know really any theoretically really principled answers to that. I know people have done it, and I think they've done it ad hoc in multiple ways, including some of our work. Doing this in a very theoretically sound way remains, I think, an open problem.
Thanks.
Which is not the answer maybe you wanted, but.
I think I was mostly like looking for, like, is it actually useful to build up this common sense knowledge much more, or maybe like interactively learning from the specific tasks that humans have requested from the robot? Maybe there is common sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Draw from there. So that's the direction I was looking at.
That absolutely right. And so we don't control where our knowledge comes from right now from this data set, because it just does. But the scenario we're envisioning is that the robot incrementally acquires this knowledge out there in the real world. Sorry, I need to quit Slack or something. That we assume that the robot acquires it, as you say, through its own observations. That doesn't mean that the knowledge isn't useful, because it just means that it'll be customized to a degree to a specific household. And then there's a really cool like cloud robotics scenario, right, where there's multiple robots in different houses, and how do they share information, and the fact that you can come to my house and you'll be able to navigate it just fine. You'll be able to find a fork just fine, because you'll generalize from other houses you've been to, which is also a really cool problem.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the great talk and accepting our invitation. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you so much.